So, I think this has been an incredible first day. I think everybody in the room deserves a round of applause. This has actually been a far better series of discussions than I had hoped, and I have very high hopes. And I am really happy to have had the chance to see the magic kind of happen with practitioners and academics and a whole host of people basically talking to each other about these really pressing questions. Tomorrow is movie day, class. So, so we're gonna have two films. Neither of the filmmakers, as far as I know, have come today, so I can't give them a kind of name check and a shout out. But Brett Story and Paul Aboud have both done really fantastic work, working in very different genres cinematically, I may venture to say. But really pushing, I think, some important discussions and themes. And so we'll start the day tomorrow with a film, and you can use that as you wish. If you've already seen the film, you can wander in late, and you don't need a pass. But if you want to come, there's no better place to watch a film like The Prison in 12 Landscapes than in a theater, right here in these chairs. So I'm so happy that we have the space for that. The other thing for tomorrow, as many of you know, it'll be a kind of two-location affair. So if you have concerns or questions about parking or carpooling, you may want to work that out. If you've made a friend today in the room, we will have the bulk of the events here between basically 9 and like 3:30, 3:45. And then we'll be moving across the street and halfway up the block to Red Emma's for the final event of the day, which will actually feature David Stein, Glenore Shirley, and Dan Berger, who I'm bringing to the podium, albeit briefly, in a moment. Now, again, I wanted to also encourage people, if you, for whatever reason, can't make it tomorrow, to try to follow the proceedings by way of the live stream. I had a chance to drop in a couple times today. It's literally like maybe a 3-second lag, but otherwise you're right there and you can issue comments. And it's actually pretty amazing. So I want to thank Hero, our video guy, who's done an amazing job all day. Open Range Video. Is a fantastic group to work with. And as some of you know or have noticed, it actually is able to show the conference proceedings in the lobby while it's going on in the lounge. So I didn't miss anything, even having to go out and like call and make sure pick up and drop off went smoothly and all that stuff. So, okay, there it is. Take pictures wherever you like. And it's a good place to make a cell phone call because the windows and all that. People are like, oh, okay. Okay, so we're going to try to wind down and in some ways wind up a series of questions and conversations. I want to bring to the podium Dan Berger, who is an associate professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. He's the author or editor of several books. I've had the chance to see his CV, and almost every time it hits my email, I see my computer kind of shake a little bit. He's got crazy ink he spilled already. His most famous book, for which he won the James Raleigh Prize from the Organization of American Historians, which if some of you who aren't among the historian clique know or may not know, that's like a major like group that we all hang out with together once a year and like do our thing. So he got a major social history prize for the book Captive Nation: Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era. And it was, in fact, Dan's work, and particularly his handling of George Jackson as an intellectual, that inspired me to even consider this conference in the first place. It really is a phenomenal achievement. The other book that he just dropped with Toussaint Lozier is called Rethinking the American Prison Movement, which is, as I learned yesterday, for sale in large amounts across the street at Red Emma's. Both books are actually for sale at Red Emma's. And if you're nice, maybe he'll sign a copy for you. So I told him this is very low stakes. He's not like coming to like do the keynote that Saidiya Hartman might have done. But I also wanted to recognize that of all the folks who I immediately could think of, he really does do a good job sitting at the axis of all the kinds of conversations we've been having today. And so I would encourage folks to think capaciously, and we'll be working the room, Morgan and myself, with the mics. And so, yeah, without further ado. What's that?
You're going to keep time on the...
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you,
All right, great. So thank you, Nathan, for organizing this, the other organizers who participated, and thank you for that very, very beautiful introduction. I've been, jotting notes furiously, all day, and since Nathan asked me to do this literally at 11 o'clock last night. But I want to just begin, right, by acknowledging the supreme unfairness of showing up somewhere expecting to see Saidiya Hartman and instead having to see Dan Berger. So I rest assured that I share that disappointment with you all. I want to begin actually by just, I think, as Nathan said, I think we've had really amazing conversations today about a wide range of things, and really the point of this session is just to get all of us talking. I just want to offer a few kind of prefatory remarks to maybe prime some of that conversation. But one thing in particular that I wanted to say just about that last panel and the conversation we were having about what changes when we think about the gender of incarceration, and particularly what happens when we think through women's experience of the carceral state. And the panelists spoke, and a number of you in the audience spoke about a number of things. One other thing that I want to just amplify that I think was implicit, but just to make explicit, is how much that focus on women in prison and women's experience of the carceral state, which includes women who are not incarcerated, but everything from carceral debt, as Vessel Weaver mentioned, to what a number of people mentioned about how women keep friends and family and social networks alive across and despite incarceration. Part of how that shifts our understanding of prison is that it moves us away from the conversation of mass incarceration to a conversation about prison, right? And I think it is really telling that this conference, the symposium, is called the Conference on Incarceration in the Humanities, whereas a similar kind of event even 2 years ago would probably have been called a Conference on Mass Incarceration in the Humanities. I think part of what we've seen in the last 7 to 10 years is an explosion of popular interest in mass incarceration to be sort of most broad and most generous, that I think has been really, really uneven. And I think we've highlighted a number of the challenges. But I also think the fact that we are highlighting those challenges, and I think highlighting those challenges across a number of different venues, points to the ways that our conversation is actually evolving and adapting to be where it needs to be, right? Which is that what we're talking about is not the massness of imprisonment, right? The massness is a sign of a larger brutalism, and that's the brutalism of prison itself that we want to contend with, right? How that has developed historically, how that has changed historically. And so I wanted to start off just by thinking about, we've talked a lot about the kind of narratives that get constructed, and I want to think about the kind of narratives that have been constructed in the recent period where a kind of critique of mass incarceration has enjoyed some kind of popular traction, because I think it's going to help us think through the kind of historical possibilities that exist in this moment, right? So in some ways, a kind of obvious point to start is thinking about the publication of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow in 2010. I think it's an obvious point to start, not because that book invented something, right? but because that book sort of synthesized an array of critiques and the kind of bubbling activism that had been developing for 2 decades before that book kind of appeared at the right time in the right place, and with all of its sort of limitations, as I think the kind of conversation about women in prison really speaks to, right? That book makes no mention of whatsoever. But also in that time period, right, we have the emergence and rather dramatic failure of something called bipartisan prison reform. We have not only the increased visibility, but the increased coordination of both formerly incarcerated people organizing an artistic work, as well as family members organizing an artistic work, as well as a series of hunger and labor strikes at prisons around the country, as well as a sort of uneven policies around in different prison systems that shrink some prison systems without changing the narrative of criminalization itself, right? But we've seen a tremendous sort of fluctuation in some areas, right, about who's going to prison for how long. We've seen the freedom for a number of people who are sentenced to life without parole as juveniles. And we've seen the release of a number of long-term political prisoners, Oscar Lopez Rivera being the most kind of recent. But we've also seen the death of a number of long-term political prisoners and the denial of release, right, for someone like Leonard Peltier around the same time. And we've seen really, really powerful campaigns to end cash bail and that connect the problem of prisons to the problem of policing and other aspects of the carceral state. So I actually think we're, for all of the ways that prison remains terrible and awful and remains a sort of matter of great urgency, I think we actually have seen not a tremendous amount of shifts, right? That we're living in this time when it's easy to be depressed and despairing, and there's lots of material evidence to support that affect, right? But I want to sort of lift up some of these examples to also point to I think there's sort of equal evidence for being for that optimism of the will, right? That Gramsci spoke about, and so, in the 1970s, Michael Harrington said that the country was moving left, right, and center all at the same time, and I think we're kind of find ourselves in a very similar moment, right? And so I wanted to talk just for a second about one example of how we could think about the narrative, right? This is something that's come up on all panels that we've heard today in a variety of different ways, right? How do we change the narrative? How do we shift the narrative? What institutions establish the narratives? What does it mean to shift the narrative? And so I wanted to offer an example of how I think narratives do shift, or one example of a narrative that has shifted. And then I want to use that as a sort of invitation for all of us to think across the different sectors, right, or the different kinds of venues that we occupy when we come here today, right, as media makers, as activists and organizers, as artists, as scholars, as educators, as practitioners of all kinds, right. And that example is a selfish one because it's one that I played a small role in, but I offer it only as a disclaimer to say, to locate myself within it, right? But in 2011, I was part of a group in Philadelphia of people that have been doing different kinds of work around prisons, against prisons, around supporting people in prison. And part of what we were trying to think about was we had all of these very small, disparate groups doing that work, right? So doing support work for people who are incarcerated, working, a number of them were helmed by formerly incarcerated people, and the state was trying to build 3 new prisons and expand 9 existing prisons. And so part of our thinking was everyone's stretched so thin already, right? The carceral state is sapping our capacity all the time. That's part of what the carceral state is designed to do, right? To sort of sap the capacity of communities, particularly working class communities of color, to organize, to govern. And so everyone's sapped already, but if the state builds these new prisons and expands these prisons, they're going to fill those new prisons, right? Because that's how it works, right? And so our idea was, okay, can we bring people together who are already in motion around the carceral state in some form, and can that be the basis of a coalition to say no new prisons, right? And the basis of a coalition to say that the money spent on prisons should be given back to the communities that I guess now we call justice involved, right? To the communities who the carceral state has always preyed on. And one of the policies that we can create that will get people out of prison and keep them out of prison. We're trying to think about what would be the framing to sort of highlight those 3 things, right? And we did this in consultation with similar efforts around the country, but particularly in consultation with efforts out of California, the Californians United for a Responsible Budget and the group Critical Resistance. And part of what we resolved in Philadelphia was that the name for all of those efforts was decarceration, right? So we called our group Decarcerate PA. And part of the challenge is that decarcerate is a very clunky word, right? It doesn't have a kind of, or didn't at the time, right? It didn't have the kind of resonance where people are talking about decarceration. But to us, it was the best way to sort of name the synthesis of what we were trying to accomplish. And so so we called ourselves Decarcerate PA, and we set out with that kind of platform. And then we had to talk to all these groups that were really concerned about what was going on in Philadelphia, but weren't connecting that to prison expansion, right, to prison construction. Were in some cases even participating in some of the kind of criminalizing frameworks and criminalizing languages, right, of, there's a way in which you can talk about schools, not jails, that is prison abolitionist, and there's a way you can talk about schools, not jails, in a way that is, a kind of aegis of innocence, right, that we're the good ones, and so on. And so we had to have a lot of those conversations, right? And I then left the state when I got a job in Washington. So just sort of observing it from afar. But I think that work continued. Those kinds of coalitions continued. Those kinds of conversations continued. And I think it's telling that in 2012, Pennsylvania was the only state that had a sort of right-wing Tea Party aligned governor who was defeated electorally. And in 2017, on Tuesday, last week, the city of Philadelphia just elected the most radical person to hold the district attorney's office, as far as I know, ever, right? Certainly in that city's history, right? And think about the city of Philadelphia, who, just 20 years ago was known for having the deadliest DA in the country, Lynn Abraham, who touted her pursuit of the death penalty, right? And then had a series of DAs, known for kowtowing to whatever police wanted, known for corruption of all manner, right? And Larry Krasner, the person who won the district attorney, is the person who represented Black Lives Matter activists, who represented Occupy Wall Street, who has sued the Philadelphia police almost 100 times for various kinds of violations and abuses, right? And so the fact that he was a serious candidate even, right, and much less the fact that he won, I think shows some of that shift, right? It shows actually how narratives do change, right? That we could go, I think decarcerate and decarceration is still a clunky word, right? And yet in that DA campaign, there was a whole series of organizations that were, tweeting and writing and organizing under Decarcerate the DA, right? And so I think a lot about Stuart Hall's comment that politics does not reflect majorities, it constructs them. And I think the ways that we shape the narrative, right, is not only by responding to narratives that are already out there, right, but how can we take a word that people don't know, right, a word that doesn't really sound good, and how does that actually resonate with people's sort of lived experience, right? I think there's a lot of challenges in Philadelphia. I don't lift it up as an easy victory, right? I think we don't actually know what's going to happen to have a civil rights attorney as the district attorney, right? Whose job it is to handle prosecutions. But I think it's one example of many in which we can see, right, a kind of narrative shifting over, a good 6 years / 20 years, depending on how you want to start it, of very solid, consistent organizing. Right? So, as I said, I know, right, we're a very eclectic group in terms of where we are and how we come to this conference here today. And so, actually, what I want us to do first, and I hope this doesn't, you can tell me if this is going to screw us up in terms of the filming, but I actually want us to just sort of spend a couple minutes talking with each other before we sort of talk as a big group. And I know, we're all sort of sitting by people we know, but if possible, you could talk to someone who you don't know, and just sort of spend a minute to think about, right, what brings you here today, right? Are you here as a media maker? Are you here as a grassroots organizer? Are you here as an educator, right? Recognizing that all of those positions have their own connections to the carceral state. Right? Being an educator doesn't mean that you're not also formerly incarcerated, right? Being a media maker doesn't mean that your partner or parent didn't spend all these years in prison, right? So to think about those sort of intersections of the positions that we might occupy and our kind of own connection to the carceral state, and then to think about what do you want or what do you appreciate about someone that might occupy a different sector, right? As a scholar, what do you need from what do you like about the grassroots organizers, right? As organizers, what do you appreciate about the kind of media makers who approach this subject, right? And you might think about it in the prompt that the late political scientist Joel Olson framed as what is the most change I can do? damage I can do given my biography, abilities, and commitments to the racial order and rule of capital. So I'll leave that with the prompt, and I'll ask you all to sort of talk with each other for a few minutes, and then we can actually hear from a group.
There you go.
Slightly longer than 3 minutes.
What does the clock say?
5:27. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, friends, I'm going to call us back together just so that we have a chance to sort of generalize our conversations a little bit across the room. I know that this room is not. Our chairs aren't movable.
That's right.
We have some
there's no
limitations
circle.
here.
There's no circle we can do.
But yeah, Nathan and Morgan have microphones. I would love just to sort of call into the bigger space some of the conversations that you all were having in your small groups here. Yeah.
Actually, I think it's important to note before I just touch base on what I got to share with these young folks behind me is that between 2011 and 2013, 37 schools closed in the Philadelphia School District at the same time they were slated to build those prisons. It was the same model that they were building off of Chicago during that time frame, and I think that's important to note in that narrative. I was a teacher in the Philadelphia School District. But the young folks behind me were great. We have a creative writer, we have a philosopher, and we have a justice organizer working at varying levels and degrees, and it was just awesome to have them share so openly with me. And if you all want to share more, you can. They're like, no, we shared enough. But it was great to hear, again, what stages in education they are and what brought them here today. And even in the disappointment of there not being a keynote today, still being willing and open to come was huge. So, yeah.
I already talked to Dan earlier, and we've already made an agreement that we're going to have another revolution on top of the revolution, inside of the revolution. It's all going to be changing and everything. And I just want to send out a bunch of shout-outs of appreciation for having been here. Did I say that right? Being here or been here? No, I'm still here. For being here and everything, and all the open minds that I notice. And sometimes I think I'm the only one that think like that, you know. But I did have a question regarding the panel where Sister Donna was on and others, Julili, right? They talk about penal law and they talk about correction law and they talk about criminal law, but they don't have anything in there about rehabilitation law, right? That it would be a must to follow in order for a person to become rehabilitated, you know. In Attica, we scratched their heads about it. You know, we made them scratch their heads and say, what do you mean rehabilitation law? You know, corrections law just tells you a code of conduct, how you're supposed to act within a correctional facility. So I think we should think about that, you know, if we're going to enforce rehabilitation, if that's the word, you know, you really can't get rehabilitated until you've been habilitated. And living the way we've been living, it's not, you know, a habitat or you know, it's it's a dehabilitating, you know, situation. So we have to, before you can rehabilitate somebody, you got to habilitate them. You follow what I'm saying? I didn't think of it. You know. So I think, you know, if we want to really look at it, consider that, you know, and find out. And African Americans, you know, we were dragged over here to fulfill an agreement that we never even had a open contract with. You know, he says, all right, you come over here and help us, we'll give you this. It never happened like that, you know. So that's just a thought I wanted to put in there, you know, in some, and I'm really inspired. I'm gonna have a problem when I get back to Ithaca. a party?
I spoke with Khalil, and I thought we made an interesting point about that today we're around like a lot of like-minded people and people who have already like acknowledged their capacity to change things and are like working to do that, and how it's also very difficult to convince people who who are not aware of their capacity to convince them of that capacity. So just talking about that.
So when we were first conceptualizing the conference, we got a lot of soundings and feedback from people, and academics were brilliant contrarians with each other in ways that can sometimes not always be productive. But one of the things that we had to really entertain was the question of voice and who was going to be represented at the conference. Should this be some space where the equivalent of, say, a Sheriff David Clark could come and be part of this conversation? I see some people like bristling, right? And this is like a cable news kind of approach. And I've been approached by various, public programming to say, okay, tell us who the one person is who most disagrees with your position, and we'll put them on the show with you, right? This is literally how we decide to argue. And it really does raise a question about, one, the kinds of approaches that we tend to adopt just as a set of institutions in this country, believing that we have a kind of split screen approach, and somehow that dialectic, as we imagine, is going to somehow arrive at something. But I really love, is it Alicia? Yeah. I really love Alicia's point about capacity, because some of you may know I'm an avid Facebooker. I can't actually give it up now. I'm totally like, I'm in it, and I use it for research. I use it for family pictures. It's like my thing, whatever. So I'm in it. But one of the things I like about it is that it actually does exactly this thing about informing and expanding capacity, because there are so many ways in which we wind up in conversations at various tables, and we might not be able to marshal the arguments we need when we need them, right? Bruce Lee has this whole thing about, like, the whole point of practice is like when you need a particular move, right? It is there. So if you need to roll out like Gramsci or like stats from like, the Better Business Bureau, or like, an anecdote about somebody's old granddaddy, like social media is really helpful for giving you those modes of knowledge for debate. And so all I would say is, I feel as if we're constantly being guilted into feeling as if we always have to, quote unquote, talk to the other side, right? And I want to make an argument as a mode of strategy that we do need to surround ourselves with like-minded people. At some level, that's okay, right? To not feel guilty about that, because I think we can share stories, we can share information, and that's part of the work in terms of collaborating and building networks and supporting each other. There was a point that was raised earlier, I think, by Shorty, about having revolutionary movements have a therapeutic piece kind of built into them, right? And I feel very healed today by this conversation. And so I would just encourage that as one of the things that we do is gravitate toward folks who can help build you up in a larger conversation that is largely trying to tear down your arguments. So I just wanted to make a point about that.
And can I just add one thing to both of those comments, right, is to say I think we absolutely need to like build our crew, right, have our squad. And I think, social media allows lots of ways for us to do that. And I think it's hard to think about, how would we talk to like the David Clarks of the world. But also there's a lot of people who are neither of those, right? There's lots of people out there who are not, the like hardline opposition, whose ideas are not fully formed, right? Who are very changeable, who may not yet be our friends, right? So David Stein and I wrote an article over the summer called "The Criminalized Majority," so taking up this exact point. If we think about, as Mary said earlier, right, that 1/3 of adults in the U.S. have a criminal record, right? It's about 70 million people in this country that have some kind of criminal record, right? Compare that to the number of people who belong to unions, right? Which sort of the mainstay of kind of collective action, right, in the country, or one mainstay of collective action in the country. Anybody know? David, don't answer. Right, it's about 14 million, right? At least that's what we said in our article, anyway. So, right. So you think about, right, the what is that math? It's like 3 or 4 times the number of people, right, have a criminal record who then belong to unions, right? this is a massive population of people who might not agree with us, right? They might not yet be abolitionists. They might not yet, like to see pictures of my kid all the time on Facebook, but who have an understanding and have an experience with the carceral state, right? That is the foundation of a majority, right? There's two people in the wake of Larry Krasner's win for district attorney in Philadelphia, one of whom is incarcerated and one of whom is not, who wrote an article on the blog Waging Nonviolence, making this exact point, right? People in prison who cannot vote organize their friends and family members to vote. That is why Larry Krasner not only won, but that's why Larry Krasner won with more people voting for him than have ever voted, or I think ever, at least recently, voted for a district attorney, right, in the city of Philadelphia. That is a massive constituency. And so I think part of how we have these conversations, I think we need to shift our perspective, right? That the world is not just divided between those who agree with us and those who are our opposition, right? That there's lots and lots of people who actually experience, right, the carceral state in all of its violence, or at least some of its violence, right? That's actually an organized or organizable constituency.
Just as a quick aside, and before I pass the mic again, I do give this thing away. Elsa Barkley Brown has an amazing article about black voting during Reconstruction that echoes this exact dynamic, right? Where black women who do not have the franchise are actively organizing their households in a family vote, right? And allowing then a sweep of office holders to basically remake the South and subsequently like institute public education and a whole host of really important laws. So there's historical precedent for the non-enfranchised helping to organize, politicize, educate those who do have the franchise and building movements in that way. There are actual echoes of that that we shouldn't ever forget about, Other folks. Dr. Murch.
I wanted to respond to something that Dan said and then also just pass the mic to our group. I think one of the issues to think about, too, with a 70 million criminalized majority is undoing narratives. Like we've been talking about national narratives, but also personal narratives. And one thing that I saw in Ferguson that was really moving to me is that a lot of people that were involved in those protests, not just the ones that were covered the first week in August 2014, but people that were showing up every day for 2 years, that they counted the days and they were protesting throughout a really brutal winter. But, people came out and talked about their history of incarceration, including, conviction for violent felonies. And I think that the undoing of the narrative, internalized narratives too, about shame, I think that it's a national narrative problem, and also figuring out what are the spaces that you create that allow people to, talk about their own narratives, talk about their own stories, and then, retell the story. And that seems really important to me. The other thing I wanted to say is, we had a bit of a debate on our panel, and I think that we also have to find ways to have coalition and discuss things that are difficult and find ways to disagree, but to disagree within parameters that allow us to figure out how to build further. Because I think that has to happen. I think there's a broader problem, speaking of shaming also, politically, figuring out how, generally when you bring together a group of people, not all of us agree on our own particular tendency. And it's, this is always an issue of radical movements. So figuring out how do you have discussions and talk about difficult issues and then build, because I think that's an important part of political education.
Can I say something really quick to just follow that? And then I will pass the mic as well. I want to thank Donna for that comment, because I think that it is really important to take the debates in a lot of cases off of Facebook and bring them into the room, because I think that oftentimes we think of social media as this platform that has a lot of organizing power, but figuring out how to actually realize that organizing power on the ground is a different discussion in a way. And I think that being in a room where we can work out and talk out these issues with each other is super important, because we can respond not just when we have a coffee break from work and the thread is 40 people more long than it was than we originally commented. And I think listening to Vesla and Donna and Jalili and Talitha kind of talk out what they were thinking through together is just so productive. And I'm so honored to have been a part and an observer of it. Does anybody else want the mic on this side?
do identify yourself when you say things.
Hi there. I'm David Stein, and I was thinking about what you just said, Donna, and I really, really appreciate it. And thinking about it in the context of the late great activist Rose Braz, who maybe not all of us in this room know. Rose was a founding member and longtime staffer of Critical Resistance. I feel fairly confident that we wouldn't all be in this room together. I certainly wouldn't be here if it weren't for the work that Rose Braz did. Rose passed away a few months ago. But something that Rose taught me was thinking about what you said, Donna, is that if you're not uncomfortable in your coalition, it's not a coalition. And Rose worked really, really hard to build coalitions. And I really wanted to lift up this story about struggle and failure, which is Rose helped build a coalition to fight the Delano II prison in California, which eventually got built. But Rose would enlist and did enlist everyone she could and everything she could in that coalition, including the endangered Tipton kangaroo rat. She helped found an organization called the Friends of the Kangaroo Rat, which helped keep the Delano II prison from opening and from building it and from opening for 4 years than they had intended it to be built. There's 5,000 people in that prison right now. And so if we multiply that out, that's 20,000 years of human freedom that existed on this planet that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for the work of Rose, the Friends of the Tipton Kangaroo Rat, and many other people. And I think we can draw these kind of broader legacies of that was there was one more prison built in California, but a smaller one. And since then, California prisons have decreased by tens of thousands. And so I think these struggles that we fight and that we win and we search for allies for everyone from the Tipton Kangaroo Rat to people who we might disagree with. And I really agree with you about the point of like, Dan knows this, where I'm strongly against the kind of right on crime bipartisan move, but I do think we have to ask these questions of who shares our social values. And I think that's one of the things I've really been appreciating throughout this day, of all the people coming from so many different sectors and sharing their experiences and their knowledge. So now I'm just rambling.
I'm part of the Baltimore block, and we do a lot of organizing around police brutality. I deal with Out for Justice, and that's an ex-felon-led organization that helps recidivism, and they deal with mass incarceration. I appreciate y'all being here because this gives me, and I don't feel so bad in the work I do, that I know I ain't working by myself. I led the march. I was part of the people that led the march here to tear down the statues. I don't know if y'all was there, but I was the dude in the front. All right, I was the one. I was the dude in the front, and right there at that moment in time, we was dismantling the statues of racism and inequalities. But if we want to really make this go further, we gotta dismantle the racist institutions and the courts and the justice system, and we gotta start attacking it the same way that we attack them statues. And through your intellectual paralysis and all these accolades that y'all got, I think we can make that happen.
Anyone?
Great. So thanks. My name is Sam Scharf. Our group had a really interesting and productive conversation about just thinking about the themes of coalition and identifying productive disagreements that can define coalition. So we got into a conversation about a location of free will and agency in the conversations that we've been having today. What is the cause of crime? What are the determining factors? Is crime purely determined by external forces? What is the room of agency in our actors? Does responsibility come with any of that agency? And neither of us had like a pure, like, zealous position in this, but it's an interesting question. How do we create liberating work that can contribute to emancipatory political movements while still considering the responsibility that can come with agency that we're trying to restore. So I'll pass the mic to others in our group.
I'll jump in. I think part of what was interesting, we were trying to connect. So we had two lawyers, an educator, and someone becoming both a medical doctor and an historian. And one of the reasons we got caught up in that is because the professions in this country are so, I refer to it as like fundamentalist individualism. The lawyers and the doctors amongst us, we are so, it is so extraordinarily hard to get out of, the view of a person, of how we come to be, of how we become over time, that isn't part of the legal model, that isn't part of a criminal justice model, that isn't part of an economic model. That's really regressive, and it leads at best to rehabilitation. This resonates with, I think, the historian panel. So we were just, as sort of people ourselves, marred by this trainings we've had as lawyers and doctors, trying to listen to a room like this where, there's just a call for there's a huge drive for such a more socially rich view of who we are and where we've come from and how we come to be who we are in every moment of the day. And that's not what law and medicine, teaches us to do. So thinking about coalition building when we have, the bulwarks of these, the whole systems are built out of these very regressive professional trainings. And we got to do something about it. So we had an argument, and that was a good start. Amy, do you want to say that?
So this is TL. Talila, everybody calls me TL. I just want to remind us all of our immense privilege. We're talking about a lot of things that we are not in close proximity to often. A lot of today has been filled with grandiloquence and super elitism, a lot of classism. There's a lack of acknowledgement of the inability of a lot of folks to actually even enter this space. And that frustrates me beyond measure. Academics and universities are some of the most violent spaces, in particular because we have all convinced ourselves that we are righteous and that we are right. I've witnessed today a lot of violence toward people of color in this space, toward low and no income people in this space, toward formerly incarcerated people in this space, toward women in this space, that has gone unchecked by those in positions of privilege. And we have to look inward before we look outward. Violence begins with us. If we are part of the academy, if we are part of the legal profession, the medical profession, we are actually perpetuating violence in ways that we aren't even acknowledging or recognizing. And I think that's part of the conversation that's been missing today. What sorts of violence are we actually engaged in our own spaces, on our own panels? Because I've actually witnessed it on some panels today. That's what I think we should be talking about during this town hall, and then calling on, again, we got Baltimore Block in the house, but there's tons of grassroots organizers in Baltimore that should be in this space, because we can't have a town hall meeting without the town, right? And so for me, I get very, very frustrated in a lot of academic and legal spaces for this very reason. But I think that we always should be naming that and figuring out how we can do better. And if you are a person of privilege in this space, you need to be checking your time on the mic and passing the mic. Because people who are marginalized, multiply marginalized, often aren't going to feel as comfortable grabbing the mic as a lot of white males, wealthy white women, academics in this space. So y'all need to be yielding the floor. Thank you.
Can I just, is this on? Okay. My name is Aya. I'm one of the co-organizing help people. I just really wanted to take a minute and affirm what TL is bringing up, because I think if we're going to talk about revolution, we're going to talk about, really bringing about meaningful change, we have to think about who isn't here right now and how do we get them here. because it's not a true coalition if everybody's not at the table. And just also affirming what you were saying about passing the mic, we often sort of frame these discussions as being a voice for people who are voiceless, but instead of being that voice, just pass the mic.
There's no such thing as voiceless people. There are people who are consciously not listened to. And so all of us should be uplifting and really amplifying. Nobody here is speaking for anyone else. And that's something that I've actually heard a lot of people doing today, which is also a form of violence. And so we need to be careful about that as well. We could have had hella people call in from prisons and jails today. I mean, I hope every single one of us knows somebody who's incarcerated, or several somebodies, or hundreds of somebodies. Like, that's the work that we should be engaged in, because if we're organizing without those who are currently incarcerated, we're not really doing something right. And yeah, okay, we're bringing them into the space by talking about, our books that we bring into prison or blah, blah, blah. That's great. Like, but bringing them into the space as best as we can. I talk about freedom privilege. So I created this concept called freedom privilege that most folks don't really talk about. So we talk about white privilege, wealth privilege, education privilege, blah, blah, blah. All of us here have freedom privilege. Whether or not you're formerly incarcerated, never been incarcerated, what we have, and the reason why I hope so many of us are working so hard to dismantle carceral systems. By the way, stop using corrections, stop using rehabilitation, stop using facility, like cages is sufficient, right? Like kid prisons, if you want to call them that. Like, it's funny because academics always think they're super radical and like, y'all not, like, and that's something that we have to name too, right? Like, we could have a lot more progressive folks in this space right now. So I know that we all think that we're super hyper radical, but we're not quite there yet, and we should always be reaching to be more quote unquote radical, which isn't really that radical to say we should just abolish all prisons, right? Like, that's not radical. Or I hope nobody in this space thinks it is, and if you do, then I don't care. But that's where we need to be reaching. So yeah, harm reduction and prison abolition is where it's at. There's no such thing as rehabilitation in carceral spaces, and that's where I want to leave it. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask for your name, because I wrote down freedom privilege, because I think that's a cool concept, but I want to write down your name because
No, I'm not going to be able
to. My name is Talila, T as in Thomas, A-L-I-L-A. Last name Lewis, L-E-W-I-S, but everyone calls me TL. Thanks.
My name is Tora Musgrove. These lovely ladies made me think of an experience I had with my mother as a young person, experience that just, again, defines who I am, hopefully. And because we haven't talked about the faith-based community or the significance of especially Black churches in the civil rights movement being a support to the to people who are incarcerated. And as a young person, I watched my mother and the women of Bethel AME Church here in Baltimore create a women's center for a lot of women who were in transition, who were coming home from prison. And it was a safe space, is the best way I could define it. I was a little person walking around, but I knew I was in the presence of beautiful beauty. I was just in the presence of beauty. I was in the presence of support. I was in the presence of women who were going to make sure that even in the face of a very patriarchal setup at this major church, we're going to set up, again, a safe space where these women had classes that were connected to the Baltimore Community College that they could get credit for. There was music, there was art, there were town hall meetings, there was input, there was prayer. Most significant. Thank you, Mother. This is my mother, Margaret Musgrove, who's a children's book author. But yeah, there was prayer, and there was unity in prayer, and love for each other. So I just wanted to share that.
Anyone else? Okay. All right. So we get to do this again tomorrow in a slightly different format. I think it's very fruitful to take the inspiration and the indignation expressed in the room and to meditate on that. Some of us will medicate on that. And I think it's also really important to allow, I think as a number of the commenters have already alluded to, the full range of people's political expressions to be on the table. And so I'm very happy that that happened this afternoon. We have that a hand up over there, Shorty?
Like TL said, you got one more day tomorrow, and y'all gonna be
Yeah.
at Red Emma's around 4 o'clock, and that's like a little cultural center for a lot of people. We do a lot of work over at Red Emma. You can get online. Like I found out about this from somebody else's page. They didn't even like want us to know about it. You feel me?
Right.
Just like it's a hidden. You want to say that you're doing the work, but you hiding it from
So
the
this-
people it's involved with.
Right.
So it's like me just. I do a lot of organizing. Y'all need to do a little bit better in your organizing, and y'all need to be more inclusive. You know what I'm saying? You got people in this room that when we said shut Hopkins down in March, we had like a couple thousand people, less than a couple hours. Feel me? A little bit more promotion and promote it tonight so they show up tomorrow. For real, for real.
Okay.
They ain't gonna eat all your food.
Okay. So I'm actually going to respond because I think that there have been a couple of things that have been said today that are worth responding to, and it's about capacity and it's about coalition, right? And one I want to say is that it is extraordinarily difficult to take an institution of any kind and to push it in a progressive direction, especially a conservative institution like the one that we belong to, many of us who organize the conference. And this isn't an apology, but I think it's appropriate to be able to say that among folks who are doing this work, there's some sense that this is actually a pretty path-breaking gathering insofar as it being off campus and populated with folks who are coming from a variety of different positions. Now, is there more work to be done? Absolutely. No, I'm not saying you're knocking me, but I think it's really important to bear in mind that capacity is a real thing for everybody, and I think part of what ends up happening in terms of expressing people's frustration isn't even directed towards you specifically, but it's really important to keep in mind that if we are educators, we don't teach our students through shaming them or being indignant at them. If we're deficient in our knowledge, then we help them along the way and give them a vocabulary that they need. And the same way that we would demonstrate that kind of care with our students, we should demonstrate that kind of care with each other. I think one of the things that's very clear, even among the fellow travelers in this room, is that people are down to do the reading, they're down to do the work. And if we don't have the vocabulary right away, then damn it, we're gonna get there. But it's gotta be a process. And that process will not happen if we leave here feeling as if we should feel worse than feel better. I mean, I'm echoing your point about therapy, right? Because I think, in some ways there's a lot of work that could and should happen that requires steps to be made. I'll be very concrete about this one. We tried to get a sign language person up in here, and we didn't have the $4,000 it would have cost to do that, right? Now, Hopkins got a lot of money, but we ran out on that particular budget item. You see what I'm saying? So we can be as sensitive as we want to be to the issues involved, but it's also a question of capacity. And relative to getting the word out, everybody here has now been deputized to go ahead and get the word out and change the crowd for tomorrow. Because I think you're right about that. And to know that we've got a space here and a space across the street that's even more public to bring everybody to and have everybody be involved, right? And so I just want to be very conscious of the fact that the work that goes into just creating a moment should not be treated as if it's inherently deficient because it's not totalizing. And I say that as somebody who got sick and put on a lot of weight trying to organize a conference. I'm just saying. So, what's that? Yeah. All right. And I don't need to have the last word either because I have mic privilege for sure. Yes, there's no online audience. We've been live streaming all day. And I'm happy to continue that tomorrow. That again has a price tag, and we can talk about ways to defray those expenses for other kinds of moments when the time comes. But I'm very happy that we were able to do that this afternoon as well. Okay, I really don't want that to be the last word. Okay. Okay, good.
Where do I live stream it at?
So there's a Facebook page. So we're operating through the corporations. Yeah, so it's a Facebook page. Okay. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I'm very happy at this first day. I feel a great deal of pride and fulfillment. But it's not just about my personal sense. I think from what I can gather, at least the feeling in the room is that folks are coming away from this with some kind of meaning. So yeah, we'll see y'all tomorrow. All right, meeting adjourned.